Welcome back. We are still at Unit 3, and we want to continue our discussion in terms of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Just to quickly recap what we have already looked at, we have been looking at the impact of price level on aggregate demand. And there are some assumptions that we have made. And the assumptions are that everything else within the economy stays the same. They are constant. So inflation is not changing. Interest rates are not changing. All of these things are kept as being constant. And therefore, we are looking at what is the impact of the price level, a change in prices. What is that going to have on GDP? Remember, GDP is determined by Y, and the price level here is determined by P. And we are saying that all things considered, when all the other variables are kept constant, then if there is a downward movement, if there's a downward movement in terms of the price, then what that will do is it will increase spending within the economy. Therefore, GDP is also going to increase. The other thing that we want to have a look at, though, is what creates a shift in the curve. So far we have looked at movements up and down the curve. So down the curve, up the curve. We have been looking at movements, but the curve remains the same. It's just this line alone. But what happens when the line actually moves? So that's what we're going to be looking at next. So just to go back to a quick diagram. So let's say that this is our graph, and we have, that's one line representing aggregate demand. That's another line representing aggregate demand. And that's another line representing aggregate demand. So we have three lines. Let me adjust the middle line. All right, so if we use the orange line as our frame of reference, then what we are saying is that if we move towards the blue line, then we have shifted the aggregate demand line to the right. And if we move towards the black line, then we are shifting the AD line to the left. Now, what is the implication of having a shift in any of these lines? Well, if we look at an arbitrary price, let's call it P1. And we draw a line going straight so that it cuts each of these lines. And then we have a look at what happens to GDP, what happens to Y in that scenario. Then we are going to see that there are going to be different levels of GDP. So let's call this one Y1A, then Y1B, and let's say Y1 Y1C. Now we should be able to see here that for a given price level, if there is a shift to the right, then Y1C is going to be greater than Y1B. Remember, we are using the orange line as our frame of reference. So this is our reference point. This is what would happen if it shifts to the right. And we are seeing, therefore, that at this price level, the same price level P, at this price level P, we are generating more in terms of the demand than for the orange line. And if we compare it the other way, then we are going to see that Y1C, sorry, that should be Y1B, which is our reference point, is actually greater than Y1A. Once again, that's our reference point. And in this case, that is going to be our shift to the left. So let me put SL, shift left. And up here, let me put SR, shift right. Now, if we look at any arbitrary price point and we do this analysis, we see that this is true for all price levels within the economy. So the relationship holds true for all price levels within the economy. If there's a shift to the right, then for all price points within the economy, the GDP is going to be more. And if we shift left, then for all price points within the economy, then the GDP is going to be less. Now, the next thing that we need to figure out is, well, what could cause a shift in the AD curve? We have already looked at what creates movements up and down the curve. But now we are looking at what is creating this shift if we assume that the price level is being kept constant. So remember, we are not changing the price level, but still the curve has shifted. And we're asking ourselves, what can give rise to that? Well, let's go back to our formula, which says that Y, which is the same thing as the aggregate demand, is equal to the consumption by the households plus investment by the firms plus whatever government spending is going to occur plus our net exports. So that's what the foreigners are going to be bringing to the table. Now, based on all of those being true, if we assume that there has been some movement in terms of GDP, let's say GDP has increased. So we're going with this scenario. So GDP has increased. Well, based on the formula, what can create an increase in GDP? Well, it could be that people are spending more. So households are spending more. It could be that investment is going up. So the firms are spending more. It could be that the government is spending more. Or it could be that, the foreigners, they are spending more. Any one of these movements or combination of these movements, as long as it is not attributable to an increase or decrease in price, then that will cause a shift in the curve. So here are some common reasons. consumer confidence. So consumer confidence goes up. So that's one thing that can create a shift in the curve. Imagine if we wake up tomorrow morning and we hear that oil is going to be made available. So we have found oil and we are going to now start taking steps to make use of that oil. Then this might have a ripple effect in the economy in terms of persons, consumers, their confidence is going to go up. So all the persons who don't have a job, they are now going to start to think that, they can get some sort of employment in these new industries that are going to be created. And based on that, there's maybe borrow loans from friends and family to buy work clothes or to go back to school. And all of this would stimulate more spending within the economy. So if the consumer confidence goes up, then there can be a shift in the curve, and we are shifting to the right. What else can create a shift in the curve? Well, what happens if business confidence goes up? Well, if business confidence goes up, then business are going to want to do more investments. So they're going to want to buy larger equipments, hire more people, and so on, because they want to put themselves in a position where they can start to create more. And because of this, they are going to spend some money so that they can take advantage. And by doing this, we are shifting the curve once again to the right. Well, what about government spending? Well, if governments start to give things like subsidies, let's say that all of a sudden government decides that they are going to provide subsidies on motor vehicles, on hybrid motor vehicles, then all of a sudden persons are going to want to start to buy these hybrid motor vehicles. So they are going to be looking at the fact that it's hybrid, so it might give them some savings in terms of, fuel cost, etc. And because the government is putting up some money for this, then, a lot of persons may want to take advantage of this. By so doing, we are going to be stimulating expenditure or spending within the economy. And so therefore, once again, the curve is going to shift to the right. We also have to look at things like how foreigners are going to view our country. So let's say the foreigners' perspective. So if we get up tomorrow morning and we hear that, sunlight, being exposed to sunlight has some anti-cancer properties, as well as it reduces anxiety, reduces stroke, and so on, then all of a sudden, our hotels would not have spaces to keep people, because a lot of people would now want to be coming to the Caribbean and Jamaica in particular, so that they can avail themselves of the sunlight. Once they come here, then of course they will be purchasing things within our economy. And so once again, we would be stimulating our economy. And so the curve is once again going to shift to the right. So these are some of the reasons wherein which we can see a shift in the aggregate demand curve. So we have looked at aggregate demand. We have looked at how it changes in terms of movements up and down the curve. And we have also looked at the factors that can impact a shift of the curve. Key point to remember here is, if we're talking about movement up and down the curve, We are saying that we are holding everything else in the economy constant, and we are just looking at the impact of price changes on GDP. Whereas when we are talking about a shift in the curve, we are saying that we are holding the price levels constant. And then we are looking at the other things that can create an increase or a decrease in GDP. And based on those factors, then we can see the curve shifting either to the right or to the left. So we have completed our discussion on aggregate demand, and now we want to have our discussion about aggregate supply. So that's aggregate supply. Now, in order to appreciate what is happening in aggregate supply, we have to be aware of the difference between the classical view. So the classical view versus the Keynesian view. So let's have a quick look at the classical view. In the classical view, the belief is that markets are self-regulating. In other words, let us leave the market forces to do what they will, and things will balance out. So that's one assumption that guides the classical theory. Another assumption that guides the classical theory is the belief that wages and prices are flexible. So because they are flexible, then what it means is that they will change and adapt as the market forces play out. And this is how markets would self-regulate themselves. That's the belief, or that's the theory. Another thing is that it is believed that the economy will move towards full employment. And what this really says is, over time, everybody who is able to work and wants to work will find work. So that is what is believed. And this is based on the flexibility of the wages. In other words, if there's a huge supply of workers, then the businesses, the firms, can now lower prices and get more people to come in, because people will be competing against each other for employment. Therefore, the power would be in the hands of the firms. So they can now pick, choose, and refuse who they are going to employ. And as such, they can set lower wages. Now, in that case, then what it means is that more persons become employed until we reach the point where full employment occurs. Everybody who wants to work is able to work. Well, who wants to work and is able to work will find work. Another thing that guides the thought process in terms of the classical model is that if we look at aggregate supply over time, it's going to be a vertical line. And the line is vertical. So just quickly, we have our graph there. And this line here will be denoted as the aggregate supply line. And what this essentially tells us is that for any given price point, any given price point, so let's say P1 and P2, if we go over, because the line is vertical, then what it means is that the GDP produced at any of those price points is going to be the same. So this is the long-term view of what occurs within the economy. The downside is that the short-term view of the economy is not considered. So the short-term view is not considered. Another thing that we want to bear in mind about the classical model is that it is believed that production is guided by the ability to produce. So this is based on ability to produce. So once firms have the ability to produce, they will produce. So once they have labor and once they have capital, etc., then it is believed that they will just produce and produce until they reach that point of full employment where they are now operating at full capacity. The other thing is that it is believed that aggregate demand is going to create rising prices. And the reason why this happens is because the assumption is that we're operating at full employment. And if we are operating at full employment, then what it means is that we really cannot create anything more or much more because we are already at our capacity. Therefore, if persons are demanding more, so if persons are demanding more and we can't create any more, then what we will do or what firms will do is raise prices, because of the scarcity. So that's the other thing that is believed. And finally, governments should not intervene. And they believe that government should not intervene because the markets are going to self-regulate themselves and wages and prices are flexible, and the economy, if left alone, will move towards full employment. And if we are at full employment, then it means that production is going to be at its optimal value. So those are the beliefs of the classical model. Now, I would have started out our whole discussion in terms of looking at models by saying that models are basically theories. And as George Box says, all models are wrong, but some of them are useful. And so we have to view that in mind, that there are going to be pros and cons for each of these models that we are going to be looking at. And so the Keynesian view kind of contrasts with the classical view, because Keynes believed that, well, markets will not self-regulate. In other words, he's saying that it's naive to believe that if we just leave things to themselves, then they will reach that optimal point. He's also saying that wages and prices are sticky or inflexible. So they are sticky, they are inflexible. And the point he's making here is that when persons have wages and the wages are at a particular price point, then nobody is going to be willing to accept wages at a lower price point than that. And if a firm just arbitrarily chooses to start rising prices, then persons have the option of not purchasing at those price points. And so what he's saying here is that, we have to be a bit more careful because things are more nuanced than the classical model puts forward. Now, whereas the classical model is saying that economy will move towards full employment, the Keynesian view is saying there are periods where unemployment exists for protracted periods. So there are periods of protracted unemployment. And he would point to, cases of recession, etc., as being evidence of that fact. He's also saying that under the classical viewpoint, you don't consider the short-term view of the economy. And therefore, he's saying in his model, under the short-term view of the economy, it will be a upward sloping aggregate supply curve, which contrasts with, just that we are going to end up at this vertical line. He's saying it's a bit more nuanced than that. There's going to be this line that slopes upward. If you want to view it from another lens, you can view it as being going up, and then at some point, it kind of becomes vertical. And just bear with my diagrams, right? They are not as straight as they ought to be, but I think you'll get the point. All right, so we're saying here that consider the short term and long term. Then, whereas classical says that production is based on the ability to produce, he's saying that production is based on aggregate demand. In other words, why should we produce more if people are not demanding more? So the more people demand is the more we will produce. So let me just write that properly. So production is based on aggregate demand. All right, great. Now, whereas aggregate demand creates rising prices under the classical model, he is putting forward the theory that aggregate demand will create more production, which is basically the same thing that we have said in point 5. So aggregate demand is not going to just create rising prices. It's going to, first of all, create more productivity until we reach that point where we are operating at the optimal threshold of our productive capacities. And finally, he's also saying that, listen, governments should intervene. In other words, governments should be setting policies, etc., that will help to create the kind of environment that you want to create that is better for your citizens, better for your country, etc. So we have now completed our look at aggregate demand. We have looked at the movements up and down the curve. We have also looked at aggregate demand and how the curve can shift to the left or right based on certain factors. And we have also looked at the concept of aggregate supply. And we have contrasted the classical model with the Keynesian model. And now you are left with this toolkit whereby you can analyze what is happening within the economy through different lenses. And based on that, you can take action that is pertinent to you based on how you look at these different theories and how you choose to apply them to the situations that are in front of you. So this concludes this section of Unit 3, and stay tuned for the next section where we'll be looking at things like multipliers and accelerators.